Hello, I am S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about a topic that I have to tread lightly on here on the Tube of You. Hopefully, next week or the week after, I will be loading more regularly on the Shoot of Bit, but I made a promise about my Trinity video, and I still haven't finished it because I am a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to the videos I care more about. On the Tube of You, I tend to be more cautious. About half of my comments don't show up anymore. I've been banned a few times for posting for 24 hours. Supposedly because my comments are so heated and hostile and angry, but the comments I'm replying to are worse than mine. And the simple truth is, instead of these 24-hour timeouts making me calmer, they make me more angry and embittered, especially since it simply is obvious at this point that certain people of certain political or religious beliefs are being disproportionately subjected to restrictions on what they can say. Even though Gaggle and Alphabet claim that this is not so, and we've even had news articles saying that conservatives aren't being targeted for any sort of special treatment, just hate speech is, and it just happens, of course, that conservatives are more hateful than liberals and are the ones who make all the hate speech. We can see very clearly that that isn't the case, especially in the wake of the re-election of Donald Trump, a name that, when I named, I had a good chance of getting a channel strike or something wrong with my channel, should I mention that name, until his victory in the 2024 elections. And even owing to that, I am cautious. That's why I'm talking the way I am. I am going to use a lot of euphemism, and I'm going to use some funny comical voices through parts of the video, and I'm going to talk like a normal person does sometimes with too many ums, and breaks. I don't normally talk that way, but this helps the intelligence synthetica to not notice what I'm actually saying, which shouldn't be the case. But it is. However, the winds of change are coming. We have noticed that in the wake of the 2024 electoral victory by Donald Trump, a clearly decisive victory, that the old legacy media is collapsing, with many dismissals being announced, either directly by saying John Smith and Peter Jones will no longer be with us, to indirectly at this time by saying that there will be certain ones who we let go, but we haven't told you who yet. MSNBC, a mainstay of legacy media, especially promoting left-wing politics, will be shutting down. We have also seen a collapse in their ratings. Granted, they'd been declining for years as more and more people turn to the internet and sites like the Tube of You to gain their news, which is understandable. The old March of Progress story, where the old is replaced by the new, but then the new itself grows in power and prosperity until another new thing comes along and replaces it. Newspapers are virtually extinct. We still have some paper newspapers, but once the internet came along, they started to decline sharply. But newspapers actually began to decline with the proliferation of radio, as more people could get the news on radio than a newspaper. But that didn't really spell a terminal decline for newspapers. Television saw another great hit to newspapers, and they did decline greatly due to television, but not entirely terminal, and they were able to cling to a respectable position. It was really the internet that spelled the doom of the newspaper, but not so much because the newspaper ceased to exist. It transformed into an online presence itself. However, printed newspapers are largely gone now. There are still some clinging to life, but they're no longer the prevalent, powerful force in society that they used to be. Television did the same thing to radio. Radio used to be the dominant form of both entertainment and news. You've got music, you've got drama shows, you've got comedy, you got everything on the radio, and then television came along and largely displaced that because people enjoyed watching a story that's being presented rather than just listening to one. There are, of course, still radio dramas, both reruns of old ones and creations of new ones, but they're not as prevalent as they once were. Regular broadcast television gave way to cable, with its plethora of choices, hundreds of channels. And now that is falling by the wayside to the millions of YouTube channels, some run even by just amateurs. March of progress. But the legacy media doesn't want to go quietly into that good night, but wishes to rage against the great replacement that the internet gives. And it's doing so by taking largely the same strategy that newspapers have. Newspapers, of course, didn't really go away. They simply became online newspapers where people can read the articles online and still proliferate online. And it looks like legacy media channels wish to follow some form of similar strategy, though it isn't identical. Mainly by making deals with various corporations like Alphabet in order to show favoritism to official channels as, well, more trustworthy than others, to give them special preferences in various search results and to make them more visible and to promote them as trustworthy. The problem with that strategy is that you still have people looking at other sources, so they downgrade them. They even go so far as to shadow ban them to some extent, and putting those community notices under things, not showing you in search results, making it harder to find. And, of course, doing the infamous online fact checks, which don't always do what they are supposed to do by checking the facts. But therein lies the point. Gaggle and other media companies made deals with the government and with old established media to maintain a narrative and control on said narrative, where even though they denied what they were doing, notably not allowing word choice to people, and yes, I'm saying word choice instead of the FS phrase that is far more ubiquitous in normal life, but that I, for whatever reason, can no longer use here on this platform, ironically. But they sought to control the narrative. And for a while, even though people complained, especially people on the right, especially conservatives, especially Christians, their concerns were dismissed as it's not really happening at all, or yes, it's happening, but we're not actually targeting political or religious views, we're targeting hate. And it just so happens that conservatives or religious people who believe in Christianity just happen to be more hateful than left-wingers or than atheists who are just nicer people. And while we're not saying all conservatives are hateful or all Christians are hateful, hate definitely is a problem on the right. Hate definitely is a problem with conservatives. Hate definitely is a problem with Christians. In fact, it became common to say, no hate like Christian love. But it's fairly obvious that unless you yourself were left-wing, which of course most in the modern atheist movement are, about 80 to 90% of atheists are left-wing politically, you end up with a real situation where people knew what was going on, but you had wall to wall to wall to wall coverage about how it wasn't going on, either a deafening silence or an outright denial. And we see what happened after that. This is why Elon Musk is so hated. And I'm not claiming he's perfect, but he bought Twitter. And after the purchase of Twitter, he made it a free speech platform, which allowed the proliferation of the hateful far right-wing rhetoric and Christian nationalists. At least that's what the other platforms said. They started hating Elon Musk because he didn't play by these same establishment rules that they had established, that they had set up that they had given to control the narrative. And that is why they hate Elon Musk, because he allowed word choice on Twitter, which he bizarrely renamed X. I don't know why he renamed it X. Twitter was a perfectly serviceable name. It's actually a better name than X, and he still calls the things you do on X tweets, so I don't know why, but that is neither here nor there. X became a haven for people to go to so that they could say what they want without fear of being removed or placed under restrictions. This, of course, had a campaign against it, launched by the other social media platforms and by the media that backs it, and even by the United States government and certain other governments in Europe, talking about how it became a haven for far-right extremism and hate and white Christian nationalism. They attempt to delegitimize X, which used to be Twitter. Backfired, though. It just gave more attention to it, and it became the number one news source for the election cycle that saw the reemergence of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States of America for a second non-consecutive term, only the second person in United States history to ever accomplish this, the other being Grover Cleveland in the 19th century. But keep in mind, word choice doesn't work like a dam. It's not like a crack forms, a little comes out, and then more and more and more happens just gradually like that. What actually happens is those who wished to control the narrative doubled and even tripled down on their effort to control word choice, and this led right up to the election, where they attempted fervently to tell you that Donald Trump's rallies were sparsely attended, and where Kamala Harris had to energize the base, and where after two unaliving attempts on Donald Trump, they downplayed them because it was making him look too good, and they wanted you to forget all about it, whilst telling us that he had squandered the goodwill afterward, and that while he had some forward momentum, he's lost it, while Kamala Harris has energized the electorate. When Joe Biden was running against Donald Trump, people began questioning whether he could go on, and after his debate performance, of course people decided that he couldn't. He was too mentally compromised. So they replaced him last minute with Kamala Harris, someone who, even though she's framing her campaign, just as Biden had, as a battle between democracy and fascism, where democracy is on the line and they must win, because if Trump wins, democracy dies and we get fascism. The simple truth is, Kamala Harris was not elected to be the candidate of the Democrat Party, so the champion of democracy was not herself democratically elected, which, make of that as you will. Nevertheless, the drum beating continued. They continued to vilify X, formerly Twitter, of course. They continued to vilify Donald Trump. They continued to talk about his single comment in a debate between himself and ABC News hosts that Kamala Harris was present at. Supposedly, of course, a debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, which was really a debate between Donald Trump and the moderators, who constantly fact-check everything he said, whilst not fact-checking anything Kamala Harris said, or giving her any hard questions. Indeed, they aided her side, very obviously. And that's sort of the weird part about the media. They tried so hard to get you to believe Kamala Harris was this intelligent, graceful protector of democracy, the woman we need. And they leaned heavily into their identity politics. She's a woman. She's of color. A woman of color could be president. And if you don't vote for that, it must be because you're a white supremacist who's racist, sexist. Even in the aftermath of the election, we see this. Only instead of it just being straight white men who are vilified, now Hispanics are being vilified, being told how their machismo culture wouldn't allow them to have a woman in charge. And of course, many Hispanics are racist against blacks, and poor Kamala Harris is black and had to put up with white and Hispanic racism, as well as white and Hispanic sexism. It's all about identity politics with them. They can't conceive of another reason why people would oppose this great president who defended democracy. The candidate defending democracy, I will remind you, was not herself democratically elected, but appointed as the candidate to defend democracy. Gave no clear view as to what she wanted to do in the future, just copy-pasted what the Biden administration had done, which people are dissatisfied with. And when she did speak, she gave ideas that were simply economically terrible. Because as much as they want to ridicule Trump for wanting to put tariffs on foreign-made goods and talking about how that will raise the prices of them, ignoring the rest of his plan as if that was the only thing he would do, like an attempt to lower or even eliminate income tax at a federal level, which would give people more money to afford these products. With Kamala Harris, you had ideas of price fixing, where they simply told you how much things would be worth, or taxing unrealized capital gains on investments. These efforts would destroy the stock market and would make it impossible to gauge actual value of goods dependent upon the relative scarcity and demand of them. We already know what price fixing does in a major industrial economy. The only time price fixing has ever worked historically is when you have a small localized economy made up primarily of handmade goods. Price fixing, in fact, was pretty standard throughout the Middle Ages and during certain periods during the Roman Empire or during the Greek imperial stage. But during those stages, almost everything you purchased was locally produced. Things that were not locally produced were brought in through wagons over time, and almost everything was simply either handmade or a product of nature with very little mass production and no modern industry. Price fixing was, in fact, something that, while it came with certain drawbacks even back then, in fact, many of the same problems now, the problems that it creates were less obvious in the past and could be mitigated against by the fact that mass communication and mass transit didn't exist either, which meant that they had an advantage that if you had a fixed price for things, everyone knew how much they were no matter where they were going, and they could predict in advance how much money they would need if they had to go to the neighboring city, which itself could be a journey of 3 or 4 days just to get there. Today, of course, we have the internet. We can just, if we're going to travel, we can check conditions in advance. We have a news cycle. We pretty well know what's going on in other places besides just where we live locally. But if you were around in the ancient world or throughout the Middle Ages, you couldn't easily know what's happening even just 30 or 40 miles away. So having a fixed common understanding of how much goods were worth and how much you would have to pay would have actually been something that was helpful, so much so that it would mitigate against any damage that is caused by scarcity. And, of course, even with cycles of famine and shortage, in general, conditions remained about the same, and they were relatively stable because you don't have mass movements of people, you don't have mass movements of goods. So what you need on a daily basis remains relatively constant, so what is and is not scarce also remains relatively constant. So price fixing worked within the agrarian societies of the past, but it would be near impossible to implement successfully within a large-scale industrial society. And even our society, which is described as post-industrial by many, is actually an industrial society that depends largely on abused labor with no rights, or even outright slave labor that we've simply outsourced to other countries. Because really, calling America post-industrial or Europe post-industrial, when we still receive mass consumer goods produced in large-scale industrial factories, we just get them from China or other countries like India. But that's disingenuous. We are not post-industrial. We simply outsourced our industry. And even then, it's not entirely true. There are still factories and industrial labor in Europe and in the United States. The United States is still an industrial power. But the point being made is that relative scarcity and demand is much more difficult when you have large-scale industrial production than it would be during an agrarian society. And Kamala Harris's plan for fixing prices on goods, even if it was only fixed on certain goods, would have been something that would not have the advantages that it had in the ancient world, where the primary advantage is that because everything is either a product of nature or handmade, you generally know how much of everything there are at any given time. And you know how much things cost generally if you travel to other cities. You don't have that advantage because, again, we already know what it's like to travel. We can simply check ahead with our technology. And in an industrial society, the scarcity that's created is often created by the market itself, not by an actual shortage of goods, like in a famine. In fact, if a famine strikes one area, you can simply ship food to it from another area that's not experiencing famine. And we also have better food storage than people did typically in antiquity, although their methods for storing food better than what we think. For instance, you can actually store eggs without refrigeration by dipping them in oils, and they can last for years, or other such facts. The simple reality is, though, that we don't really need the price fixing that we had in an agrarian society, and it won't work the same way. And taxing unrealized gains means you're taxing people for money they don't have yet, which would do nothing but allow only those who could afford to gamble with their money to buy into stocks. Because if I bought a stock and had to pay taxes on the gains that I would make in the future but don't have now, I would have to have enough money to absorb the loss in taxes while waiting for the realization of the gains. It would also make people who had that kind of money more hesitant to buy into stocks, because when you buy a stock, you are gambling because you don't know if it will pay off, and now on top of that, you have to pay an additional tax. Kamala Harris's economic plans were atrocious. She also did not seem to realize that we live in an era where people are largely abandoning Hollywood and no longer care about celebrity culture. Thanks to social media, we found out that the stars in Hollywood largely hate their audience and are out of touch with them, and people don't care about celebrities anymore, and Kamala Harris ran on a celebrity platform where she got Beyonce and Rihanna and Oprah and other people that she paid to endorse her show up to get people to go behind her. And I know Oprah said she wasn't paid to speak to Kamala Harris, but they paid $1 million to her production company, so she was paid, even if it was indirect. The simple reality is this came off as disingenuous, it came off as insincere, it came off as shallow. These aren't celebrities who are endorsing Kamala Harris because they believe in Kamala Harris. They are being paid to do so, which cast doubt on others, because even people like Mark Hamill, who famously started going anti-Trump and supporting Kamala Harris, may have been paid off, who knows? And I'm not saying all celebrities who spoke in support of Kamala Harris were being paid to do so. Many of them probably weren't. It could be very well the case that Mark Hamill really does just hate Donald Trump. He'd been talking about it even before the election, for instance. But this pallor of doubt nevertheless entered into the public imagination, and even where they didn't, the unhinged rants of celebrities against Trump and Trump voters and conservatives, and in many cases Christians, like with J. Michael Straczynski, going off on how awful Christians are, or at least conservative ones. People began to really sour on celebrities and celebrity endorsements, which was a large part of the Democrats' strategy. They didn't read the room. The same thing exists with what people were actually concerned with. People are actually concerned with the economy and with illegal immigration. And of those two issues, the Harris campaign focused on immigration, but that's all they called it, immigration. They depict, of course, Trump as racist. They've been doing so for years. And they kept talking about how Trump wants to deport immigrants, and how Trump hates immigrants, and how Trump and his voters are xenophobic, and they hate anyone who's not an American. Specifically, anyone who is not a straight, white, Christian male they hate. Or at the very least, a straight white male. They hate people of color, and they hate immigrants. And they talk about how awful it was with immigrants, and how Donald Trump has vowed to get rid of immigrants. But the issue that Trump and his campaign were addressing was never about immigration. It was about illegal immigration. And by pretending it's not about illegal immigration and that he's just going to go after immigrants in general, the electorate largely responded by calling this dishonest. And it was dishonest. The Trump campaign did not actually talk badly about immigrants. It talked about illegal immigration and the concerns that people have with economics and with potential of war abroad with a possibility of World War III and nuclear weaponry, all of those are palpable, real concerns that people actually have, especially the economic concerns, because people go to a store and food is too expensive and they can't afford to feed their own families. This is the problem with a left-wing narrative of today. You honestly can't expect people to think that your spin on what someone like Donald Trump is saying is true once Elon Musk gave word choice to people. Word choice which you have been denying for years, but claiming you're not denying, you're only getting rid of hate speech and harmful content, when it's obvious that you're disproportionately getting rid of conservative content. And what qualifies as conservative, it now includes people that used to be on the left just 20 years ago, or even just 10 years ago, as the left becomes progressively more radical. Which is ironic, since they've been drumbeating on how it's the right that's becoming more extreme. And their narrative is that the left is the same. The left is sane. The left is trying to pull closer to center. The left is trying to be reasonable. But the right is becoming more and more extreme and farther right. And as we all know, the farthest right you go is the Jerryland Party with Charlie Chaplin. The Nazis! They're Nazis! They're Nazis! Which is ironic, because even if the Nazis actually were far right-wing, that is not the only way the right could be. And the idea that racism is exclusively a right-wing trait is itself absurd, since you can easily look at historical sources, and racial politics were a big part of left-wing politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. Of course, you could say that left-wing politics back then were much further right-wing than they are today, but they really weren't. During the Progressive era, they were actually pretty left-wing by today's standards. And, of course, racism is not actually a right or left-wing issue, and the idea that if someone's racist, it's right-wing, and treating racism as inherently a right-wing value is itself dishonest and disingenuous. After all, the largest scale racial policies ever passed in the United States were passed by Democrats. And yes, I know there was a party switch, that historically the Democrats were what the Republicans were, and the Republicans were what the Democrats were, and at some point in history they switched sides so that the Republicans were the right-wingers and the Democrats the left. That party switch never happened. The Democrats were always the left-wing party, at least by American standards. And the Republicans were always considered the right-wing party. What has actually changed is that there has been a party switch, but the party switch happened more with Trump, because Trump used to be a Democrat, and a lot of people in his current cabinet used to be Democrat, like Tulsi Gabbard or RFK. They were all Democrats. So, and the shift happened as the left became further and further left. It's not even a situation where both the right has become progressively more radically right and the left has become more radically left. It is a situation where the left is growing more and more and more radically left-wing, whilst the right is actually being pulled closer to the center. The simple reality is the modern American left, as well as the left in Europe, are embracing more and more Marxist ideas, ironically in fulfillment of a prophecy from Fatima about the errors of Russia, generally understood to be communism, growing in the West should the Pope not consecrate Russia to the Sacred Heart. That's ironic because the left also tends to be, in our modern cultural parlance, anti-religion. They're atheists. Atheists who have no religion are, of course, generally left-wing. And I hate talking that way because I think that the way we understand and frame things is inherently wrong. The way we view atheism as the opposite of religion is silly. It's silly when you hear Sam Harris saying atheism is a lack of a religion. It's not. Atheism is also not a lack of belief in a God. Atheists claim God doesn't exist. They say they don't claim God doesn't exist because by definition the word means, atheist means, one who lacks belief in a God. But atheism is a belief that there is no God. And by the way, it doesn't really matter that A is in front of theism. The idea that A means without, theism means belief in a God, and you put those together, you get without belief in a God, and that's another way of saying a lack of belief in a God, is nonsense. Just like it's nonsense to say A always means not, or lack of. After all, atypical behavior is not lack of typical behavior. Atypical behavior is behavior that is odd, or strange. The affix A in front of something does not mean lack of, and atheist was historically understood as one who denies the existence of God, not one who lacks belief in God. It wasn't until the 1970s when Anthony Flew decided to just invent the new definition in the presumption of atheism. And of course now modern atheists would say that's not true, and they'll point to Bertrand Russell's teapots and say the entire point is, imagine someone said that there were teapots orbiting between Earth and Mars. The burden of proof is on the man claiming the teapots exist, not on the ones who lack belief in the teapots. Which of course is an analogy between atheists and theists, because theists claim a God exists. Therefore the burden of proof is on the theist to show that this God exists, not on the atheist, since the atheist isn't claiming anything. They lack belief. But I've actually read Bertrand Russell's teapots, and guess what? His actual argument was not, if someone claims teapots orbit between Earth and Mars, then the burden of proof is on the one making the claim of the teapots, not the one who lacks belief in teapots, with the obvious analogy being, if you claim a God exists, the burden of proof is on you to show God exists, not on the atheist who lacks belief and makes no claims. Even though the modern atheist community uses Bertrand Russell that way, the simple reality is, if you read the essay, his point is actually quite different. His point is that it is insane and stupid to believe that there are teapots orbiting between Earth and Mars. It is ridiculous, and no one would believe it. And the same is true of God. It is a self-evident fact that there are no invisible teapots between Earth and Mars, just as it is a self-evident fact that God does not exist, and all sane, rational people admit this because you look at the world and God is simply not there. Only idiots believe in God. The difference between the teapot claim and the claim that God exists is only that people do believe in God, and you're seen as insane for not believing in God. Remember, this was written quite a while ago. And that's because we have this really old book that people in a more superstitious age used to believe in was divinely written, and that has been the center of our culture for far too long, and even in our enlightened scientific age of the early 20th century, people still believe in this ridiculous ancient book of fairy tales. And because we believed in this book for so long, and it is now traditional to believe in this book, and it is entrenched in our culture, people believe in this obviously false claim that God exists, even though it's obvious God doesn't. And keep in mind, I'm not explaining Bertrand Russell's teapots because I agree with them. I don't. I actually believe God exists. But here's the problem. Bertrand Russell's teapots were not arguing that should someone claim God exists, the burden of proof is on him and him alone to show that God exists, but the atheist has no burden of proof. That is a modern idea that's being projected back on his works and is dishonest. It's rewriting history to fit a modern narrative. And the same thing exists when they try and do the same thing with quotes by Charles Bradlaugh or Anne Besant, which always baffled me why atheists would use Anne Besant, considering that They have a high degree of ostracizing those who become apostate to their "I have no religion because I'm an atheist" movement. And Besant, of course, rejected Christianity and was an atheist for a while, but she then rejected atheism in favor of occultism and became a theosophist. Nevertheless, the atheist movement is not very good at learning history, even its own history. In fact, it needs to deny it has a history so it can maintain the idea that atheism is a great big nothing burger, while demanding that we believe certain specific claims it's making without questioning them and without having to show evidence, because atheism is defined as a lack of belief in a god. And this extends well beyond their claim that God doesn't exist. We also have to accept every left-wing lunatic policy that they also promote. But then again, their tactics are all the same as you see on the left. For example, both the people on the left and the atheist movement keep referring to The Handmaid's Tale. They keep saying that their opponents want to turn society into a real-life version of The Handmaid's Tale, of Gilead, the Republic of Gilead. And that's again because the atheist movement largely began with the new atheism, which granted has lost popularity, but a lot of its ideas and cohesion of identity have continued past that. People, for instance, still love Christopher Hitchens and talk about Hitch-slapping people, even though Hitchens was basically an idiot and a plagiarist. They worship him as a god, as if he had some sort of brilliant scholarly intellect, when he really didn't. He wrote book reviews for Vanity Fair. Let's be perfectly honest. He wrote book reviews for Vanity Fair, and I am entirely convinced he didn't read the books he reviewed. He just, at best, skimmed them and used a lot of high-sounding words to convince people he was smart and knew what he was talking about. At least with Bertrand Russell, you have some actual valuable work when it comes to mathematics and logical theory, even though his atheistic ideas were also rubbish and very obviously motivated more by emotion than logic. But when it comes to someone like Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, he was popular because he made people feel smart by running other people down. And I don't really think that tactic is going to work much longer, because it's already beginning to wear thin. And Hitchens was himself a left-winger. He was a communist who valued Trotskyism. Of course, people claim that he used to be left-wing, but toward the end of his life he became right-wing. He never actually became right-wing, though. He never embraced right-wing politics. He simply supported the war in the Middle East that was being prosecuted by George W. Bush. Since George W. Bush was a Republican and on the right, and because his opponents were on the left, and it was the left opposing the war, they had this bizarre idea that Hitchens had become right-wing by supporting the war in Iraq. This is a problem with the left. It's a very superficial understanding, and this isn't even how the left used to be. This is how the left is now. It's very superficial and based on identity politics. But the problem is, you can't say Christopher Hitchens is right-wing because he supported the Iraqi war, which was itself a product of the Bush administration, and Bush is right-wing. Especially considering the reason that Bush fought the war was different than the reason that Hitchens wanted to fight it. Hitchens was actually wanting to fight a war based purely on identity politics. And as much as Bush is vilified, especially now with the narrative of white Christian nationalism and people looking only at superficial details like he fought a war with Muslims, Bush is the reason we have the phrase, Islam is a religion of peace, permeating our culture. Bush made it very clear that he was not fighting a war with Islam. Bush made it very clear that he did not hate Muslims, and that this is not a war against their religion. It is a war against political movements that happen to have occurred in Muslim cultures. However, the media decided back then to depict George Bush as a radical Christian who only cared about giving Christian rights, not really very different than the narrative today, except they didn't push it quite so hard as they do now. But that was still the narrative. He hated Muslims, and he's fighting a war with them because of their religion, and he sees himself as a crusader. And Hitchens was attracted to that, not because he wanted to promote Christianity, but because all religion was evil, and atheism needs to rule the day. We need to abolish all religion. And Hitchens framed the war in Iraq as a war against Islam, just like the left-wing media had. And in Hitchens' mind, it was not only a war against the ghastly, evil religion of Islam, but by extension, was the beginning of a war against religion itself, where religion would finally be vanquished under the heel of reason and science, and everyone would give up religion and become an atheist. And I know he said in an interview toward the end of his life he wouldn't get rid of all Christians with a magic wand, but he very much contradicted himself quite often, let's be honest. Hitchens is very much like the modern left. He wanted to fight a war in the Middle East because it was against the evil Islamic religion, and by extension religion as a whole, and it was based on his identity, because as much as the atheist movement back then insisted atheism was a great big nothing burger, it's just a lack of belief, and atheists have nothing in common but a lack of belief in a god. This was a time when atheist writers were rock stars, making millions of dollars on personal appearances and book sales, and in which they were propelled into the media to talk about their brilliant atheistic ideas. And keep in mind, they all worked for atheist organizations, and the new atheism itself was AstroTurf. The new atheism was promoted by a man whose name sounds very similar to Jack Epstein. I can't use the name properly. I'm hoping you're smart enough to figure it out if you've listened this far. Jack Epstein donated heavily to the Edge Foundation. The Edge Foundation itself is what organized the new atheist movement. It was largely to be a well-publicized one. And all four members of the new atheism, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, they all four had the same literary agent, John Brockman. And of course, the Edge Foundation had more than just Jack Epstein. It also had William Doors. I'm using a euphemism, because gaggle is gates keeping, and doesn't want certain information to go through the gates. So I'm using William Doors instead. That avoids the gates keepers at the Alphabet Corporation from catching on, because they are reliant on intelligence synthetica. The simple reality is, the new atheism got started largely as a counter to the religious right, and it was a well-funded, organized movement that took pre-existing atheist organizations, all of which are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations like the American Humanist Association, or, at the time, the Council for Secular Humanism, founded by Paul Kurtz, or American Atheists, another 501c3 tax-exempt organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, another 501c3 tax-exempt atheist organization. Humanist International, which is headquartered in America, another 501c3 tax-exempt organization, or new ones that came along, like the 501c3 tax-exempt Recovering from Religion Foundation, or later the 501c3 tax-exempt Richard Dawkins Foundation, which had American branches, and later merged with the 501c3 tax-exempt Council of Secular Humanism to become the 501c3 tax-exempt Center for Inquiry. And of course you have the 501c3 tax-exempt Internet Atheists, the 501c3 tax-exempt Rational Responders, the 501c3 tax-exempt Atheist United, and other such groups. You had Project Reason, another 501c3 tax-exempt organization that seems to have existed both to promote atheism and to pay for Sam Harris's neuroscience degree, which he got through a rather shady means and did not conduct any independent research, even though now that he has the degree, we keep referring to him as neuroscientist Sam Harris, as if he worked in hospitals for years treating people with neurological diseases, rather than contributing to a paper written by 3 other people who actually did the research while he seems to have twiddled his thumbs. But he's the neuroscientist Sam Harris now. And therein lies the point, though, because as much as people like today to say that atheism is a mere lack of belief in a god, it's obvious that atheist organizations exist and that there is an atheist community, and it is a left-wing political community that overlaps with left-wing politics. And while not everyone on the left is necessarily an atheist, and not all atheists on the left are necessarily militant atheists, the simple reality is that atheism is a belief and an idea that cannot exist independently on its own, and must connect to other ideas. And in our modern world, the atheist movement grew out of the progressive movement of the 19th century, which itself took cues from the Enlightenment, and that is why atheists are disproportionately left-wing. And you'll notice that in the early 2000s, when the new atheism really began, it began in concert with a rise of resistance against George W. Bush, the supposedly farthest right president ever, and who threatened freedom and was at the time the Charlie Chaplin of his day, instead of Donald Trump being the Charlie Chaplin of the day. And by the way, the reason I'm saying Charlie Chaplin is because of the resemblance between Charlie Chaplin and someone else, as well as the fact that Charlie Chaplin did a movie, The Dictator. Just to put that out there so people know why I'm using Charlie Chaplin the way I am. I'm not really talking about Charlie Chaplin, though, right now. I just can't use the regular name because of so much protection of democracy that happens with the social media platforms. But still, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the left has coalesced around the more radical, even Marxist ideas, and have gotten so far left and so invested in identity politics that they just can't see past that and don't understand that regular Americans are much more concerned with the price of groceries and raising rent and declining services than they are with whether or not you stand up and announce your pronouns, which people still think are ridiculous. Do we really have to say, "Hi, I'm S.K. Williams, he, him"? People don't want to have to add this ridiculous level of absurdity on things when they can barely feed their families. And yet the left made it all about identity politics and about what they euphemistically call a woman's reproductive freedom. Because they have this weird idea that just phrasing things a certain way somehow magically makes the reality about that. People who oppose a woman's reproductive freedom do so because they don't want women to be free. It can't possibly be for some other reason, like viewing women's reproductive freedom as murdering babies. No, no one believes it's murdering babies. They just say that. They really just want to control women. They hate gay people. They hate trans people. They hate women. They hate people of color. And we need to stand as identity blocks. And that's why they started losing Hispanic voters and even black voters. This was not an election over identity politics. It was an election over economics and stability and people feeling that their culture is descending into madness and moral decay. It is not a time to be pushing things that people think of as objectively immoral. It is not an era where you need to pretend that the right actually wants to go back to the 1950s America because they're all racist, sexist, xenophobes. It is a time when we need to address real issues. And while racism still exists, it is not a real issue in 2024 because people on the right are not embracing racism. You are not marching on the bridge in Selma with Martin Luther King. You're decades past that. And we are not denigrating Martin Luther King or his accomplishments by pointing out that modern white people don't need to be constantly told they're racist in 2024. And that's why the left lost. And they can't understand it because they've created an echo chamber where they don't allow people to speak the way they wish to about issues they wish to speak about, which is why they hate Twitter now, which is now called X, I know. But that they want to maintain this monopoly on information and monopoly on control of the narrative, and they are losing that control. And as they lose that control, they go into bullying people, trying to force them into that same narrative. But it's not working anymore. And it's time for the left to admit that it's not, and for them to go back to being more sane and stop trying to make everything about identity politics and vilifying people. Well, I don't have much else to say right now. I'm hoping to try and improve my video quality next year now that I think that the restrictions are being lifted, but we'll wait and see. Until then, I shall take my leave of you now, because I don't have much else to say, and no one really listens to my really long videos anyway, but maybe that'll change one day. At any rate, I'll let you go. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.